Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our third session in the Rose Foundation's 2022 Grassroots Grantee Convening. My name's Aurora. If you don't know me, I'm the program officer for our grassroots funds, and I'm happy to welcome you all today. We're going to get into how to make requests for donations, talk a bit about how to work with boards and volunteers to do fundraising, and explore how to use events to raise money for your group. So we have a pretty packed session today. This is the third of our 4 sessions on fundraising for grassroots organizations. So we've got one more next Friday, and please join us for that discussion. We're going to talk about year-end appeals and how to organize a community appeal for donations. You can find the registration links for that on our website, and the recordings and slides from the previous presentations will be up there shortly. So lots of good information there. Please feel free to share it with your networks. Okay, with that, I'll just pass it over to Leah so we can dive in for today. Leah, you ready?
Yes, welcome. And thanks everyone for joining. Today, we are really focusing in on making the ask through your board, right? Through your board members, through volunteers, and through events. All right. So last time we talked a little bit about scripts and how to pitch and how to start to feel comfortable with making the ask. And we're still going to talk about that, but we're going to talk about it through the lens of hosting events, right? What type of events could you host? And sometimes we often think of events as these really large events that take a long time to plan, and they don't necessarily have to be, right? So we are also going to cover the style of a pop-up event and how might you be able to utilize sort of the areas and the lands and the wilderness areas that you're supporting to be there at a time when a lot of people are using the area, right? So maybe not necessarily think about the gala style chicken dinner event, but a pop-up style event, right? To really align with perhaps what your organization can do and the capacity of what you all can do, right? And then also thinking through how you can use your boards and how you could build structure within committees to support the work that you are doing, because you cannot do this alone. It's really hard to go at it by yourself. You need a team, you need volunteers. So we'll talk about different structure. So the way in which we learn together, yes, there will be recordings. Also, feel free to ask questions. Okay, I'm here to serve you. And also collectively, there's a lot of knowledge where you all can learn from each other. Okay, so use the Zoom group chat. All right, ask questions, make comments, share ideas, all that kind of good stuff. We will be in 2 breakout rooms today as opportunities to chat. All right. So we will use that as opportunities to chat as well. As I mentioned before, right, I like to share books and resources in terms of where I've gotten ideas in terms of fundraising and building capacity and organizing your volunteers. So additional books and resources will always be shared throughout. And again, what we're going to talk about today is events and structure and getting your volunteers to support the work that you're doing, and also working with your boards. So I don't want folks to forget that picking up the phone and making a phone call is really important, whether it's you doing it or whether it's your volunteers doing it. Okay. You can't expect people to help without being asked. All right. And the ask that we do, it has to be really specific. All right. Because nobody knows your organization as well as you. If you want me to help, if you want to volunteer to help, what is it that you want me to do? Okay. And sometimes that means that you and your board and you and your volunteers, you actually have to figure it out, right? The specific ask. That is another thing that often goes into a fundraising plan, right? What are the asks? What do we want from people? So we make phone calls to thank people for what they've done in the past, but to also build relationships so that when you do a community appeal in November, which is literally coming up in 2 days, right? They will say yes. All right. Because ultimately, a lot of donors and a lot of people in the community get asked by a lot of organizations. And what I think what makes grassroots organizations different from every other nonprofit is that you're smaller and that you can build those personal relationships. Okay. So phone calls are a lot about building those relationships. And so that the donor remembers you, Edwin, or you, Susan, or you, John, or you, Gabriella, whenever you are making the phone calls. All right. Like that's really important. And when you're asking your board members or your volunteers, right, within the structure of how you make calls, you have to be clear about what's the purpose of the call, right? And I like to think of calls in these types of purposes, all right? Thank you calls, discovery calls. What's a discovery call? A discovery call might be somebody says, here, Leah, here's a name of somebody who might be interested in what we're doing. Well, maybe they are, but you need to call them and discover some information, right? I think of that as a discovery call. All right. Fundraising calls might be for a campaign where you're flat out asking for money. The one thing I will tell you that isn't a great use of time is cold calls, right? People aren't going to give money to people that they just don't know. All right. And so you want to, right? You want to get to discovery calls. That's better than a cold call. Okay. And I do separate out a discovery call from a cold call. Reminder, a discovery call might be, your board member or a volunteer gives you a name of somebody and they say, call this person. It's not a cold call. There's some relationship there. Okay. So I think that's really important to differentiate. So you sort of know what you're doing so you can track. Right. And all of this is about tracking what's a good use of our time. A volunteer with us calls, event tickets, right? Somebody who's doing an event at a brewery, you might pick up the phone, right? And ask people to come. Introductions might be someone's introducing you to somebody else. And campaign calls might be your year-end campaigns. All right. You always want to make sure to have a script. Okay. And this is really going to help you because it helps your volunteers, your board members remember what to say. And you may be the one that knows what to say, but if your board members or volunteers don't know what to say, the call is going to be awkward. And you can't do this alone. I want to remind you, you cannot do this alone. So I have been in positions at grassroots organizations to very large institutions. Okay. And phone calls have always been a part of what I do. I always think it's better to pick up the phone. All right. This is some things to be thinking about, right? Where do the people that you are living, where do they live? What is their time zone? All right. And what is the best time for somebody to call? Okay. I think these are good times, 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. But it depends on the individual. All right. Of course. But if you're calling folks who have kids, if you're calling senior, right? There's all these different things that you want to be thinking about. And then I think it's good to track, right? If you do phone calls from 8 a.m. to 10 a.m., how many people were you able to get a hold of, right? Who you want to be thinking about, where do they live? What is their time zone? Who are they, right? Parents with kids have a hard time picking up the phone from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. if they're doing pickups, right? So you have to think about what are their priorities? Who is the person that you are calling? Okay. So reminders about sample scripts, right? Use the person's name. All right. Share your name and your organization, right? Depends on what they know. Okay. And then tell them what you're doing, right? Ask questions, check in, see how they're doing, see how they want to get involved or donate. This is all really important. And I think it's also as a reminder, right? It's important to build those relationships. So if you know them, ask them how they're doing, right? Ask them if they volunteer, but maybe you don't remember, right? Because if you have a lot of volunteers, maybe you just don't remember. You can ask, how has your volunteer experience been with us, right? Asking these open-ended questions helps you get more information to serve people better. I always like to ask people if they have referrals. Every time I'm working in an organization that's volunteer based, I always want somebody to give me 1 to 3 names of other people that could volunteer, right? So that's basically you asking, in what ways could your friends or family get involved, right? Do you know anybody that might be interested, right? So that's something to be thinking about. So that does 2 things for you. That shows people that you need volunteers, right? That clues people in that your organization is looking for volunteers. Maybe they don't know anybody in the moment, but maybe they'll remember later. All right. So other things to be thinking about when it comes to phone calls with donors, and remember, you're not only doing this, but you're getting your board to do this. So you need to, on some level, feel comfortable sharing this information to your volunteers, right? The information that I'm sharing with you. So it's important to make sure that your volunteers and that your board know that calls align with the goals, right? They align with the why, right? And remembering the fundraising plan that you're building. Okay. So whatever type of call you make, it should align with the plan that you're building. I don't expect your plan to be done yet, right? Building a fundraising plan takes time. Okay. You do have to get comfortable with calls, and you have to get your volunteers and your board comfortable with calls, because you can't do it on your own. So that might mean, let me hear you do a practice call with me, right? Make it personal, share stories and examples. Okay. There's been many a times where I've sat in a room with volunteers, me myself being a volunteer, or me asking volunteers, and be like, go through the script. I want to hear you say it once, right? And it just helps people feel comfortable doing this work. And sometimes you can refine your stories. All right. So we're talking about all of this because your volunteers ultimately, right, and your board are going to help you with fundraising. Okay. These are some helpful books and resources. Again, a lot of are connected to community organizing and getting folks on board to do the work. And I know some of you all are still recruiting board members. Like, that's something that you need. All right. I get that. Not everybody has a full board. That I totally understand. Okay. So things to be thinking about are, if you're still recruiting board members, what type of board member do you want, right? And you have to be able to ask them how they feel about fundraising, if that's important to you. Okay. So things to think about: what is the purpose, all right, of your board? What do you need them to do? And this needs to be defined either by you or your board. Okay. So there's a governance board, right? And that is a board that primarily focuses on governing, right? Less doing, policies and procedures. It sounds like, from what I've heard, a lot of you all need working boards, people to actually do the work. All right. So you want to be clear about what it is that you need when you're asking for board members, right? We need people who will do, right? If that's what you need. Or there could be a mixed model. All right. A mixed model might be a little bit of both. If you're fiscally sponsored, you're probably then a working board. Okay. If you don't know what you are, that's fine. We can talk about that next time. All right. Or you can post in the chat. All right. So that's important to be thinking about, right? Is it governance? Is it a working board? And being really clear with people who are applying to your board or serving on your current board is important when it comes to the work of what your board does. All right. So I would love to know really quickly, and you may or may not know this, right? What is your board model? Is it a governance board? Is it a working board? Are you still figuring it out? Is it a mixed model, or do you have a fiscal sponsor? And the reason that I ask this is because it's important to think about what you are doing. And the reality is you have to align with what you're doing with what the type of board is that you have. Okay. So, oh, you just hired 5 new board members this week. Congratulations. So, one thing to think about is, what is your board, and does that align with what you're asking them to do? Okay. And with what you need. All right. So I'm going to close the poll. All right. And share where you all are at. If you want a working board and your board is more of a governance board, then ultimately, right, you might need to figure out how to build out committees to support the work that you're doing, which we'll talk about. All right. Other committee structure. Okay. So it looks like we've got some governance, some mixed model, working board, fiscal sponsor. And even if you have a fiscal sponsor, your fiscal sponsor, they're not funding you. So you might still need to go and sort of figure out how well, some of them might be, I don't know, Aurora might know more, but some fiscal sponsors do fund, don't fund, right? There's a whole mix, and there's probably still an expectation that you go and fundraise, right? And so you're still going to eventually at some point need that board or that structure where they are fundraising. Okay. So just some things to be thinking about. So your board has responsibilities. All right. Now you may be doing some of this, you may not be. All right. Your board might be aware of the programs or maybe not, right? They might be analyzing the finances, understanding the risk, planning for the future. Maybe they're involved in your fundraising plan, right? Creating your fundraising plan, equity and inclusion, review of leadership, what the structure looks like, fundraising, right? That's why we're here. They also might be advocates and ambassadors. I don't want to just say they do fundraising when the reality is boards have to do more than that. And your board might not just do fundraising. Okay. So this is typically the full responsibility of a board, maybe or maybe not for your board. And if you're fiscally sponsored, then you might have an advisory committee that doesn't necessarily function as a board. Okay. There is a question coming in. If Perla or Aurora can assist me with that, that would be great. So I would love to know, what area of board responsibilities do you need in terms of improvement? All right. So I'm going to close the poll in a few moments. And it looks like we have, let's see where we're at. So it looks like a variety of things. Glad everybody said fundraising, because that's why we're here. All right. And then a few other areas. Things to be thinking about, right? The strategic planning, right? Your board does need to be thinking about the future. Okay. So every time you think about the future, you on some level should be thinking about, what does fundraising look like in the future? Being an advocate means that when your board is at community meetings and something relevant to your organization comes up, they mention your organization. They know how to talk about your organization. They're sharing the work that your organization is doing and ways that your organization could partner or support, or all these other things, right? And that's often what a board member can do for you, even if they're not in a meeting in that moment, wearing the hat of your organization, right? If they're there for something else, you want them to be thinking about your organization. So Susan mentioned a good point. Yes, your organization fundraises for the organization. So it's regardless of their volunteers or staff, they are fundraising for the organization, right? When you plan your budget for the next year, you say, we want to raise $100,000 for the restoration. We want to raise $100,000 for XYZ program. We want to raise 100,000, like whatever it is, right? I'm just giving examples. Okay. And whenever you're asking for money, you're very specific, right? About the thing that you are asking for. All right. And so when you build out a budget, which, right, when you raise money for, when you're doing your fundraising plan, you're always thinking about, all right, we're raising XYZ for this program, XYZ for this service. It's not about the individual. Now, if you have staff, yes, staff have to get paid for their time, right? And if you have staff and you have payroll, you have to pay people for their time to run the programs, right? So if you have program staff members, right, who also support you with fundraising, you do have to pay salaries if that's an expense that you have, and it goes towards programming. Okay. So I do want to sort of separate that out. Okay. So other things to be thinking about. If the board's involved, right, with ensuring resources, then there's things that you want them to be thinking about, right? What are the resources that are needed? What are the policies that we create for how resources will be acquired? Meaning, do we do an end of the year campaign? All right. Do we, have a give or get policy, right? Where a board member has to give personally or get, right, through grant, right, or whatever it is, $500 a year, $100 a year, $50 a year, right? You decide those policies together, and everybody has to buy into the policies. Okay. Everybody has to buy in, not in the sense of not buy in, like give money. They have to agree. Okay. I used the wrong phrase. They have to agree to the policy if they're going to serve on the board. Otherwise, you're not going to have folks who are interested, right? And a big part of this is getting people to be committed, all right, beyond you, because you can't do this alone, all right? And ultimately, right, people have to know how they will participate in fundraising, all right? So what can giving look like in a board? It can look like this. People are really passionate about the work, right? They can make a meaningful donation, right? They provide resources to the organization, and they'll talk about it and they'll advocate for it, right? They assist with the development and implementation of fundraising plans. They participate in donor asks. They help with fundraising campaigns. These are specific examples, all right, of what it can look like, okay? Now, do I expect your boards to do this all immediately within 6 months? No, but eventually this might be a goal, right? And a great example just came into the chat if somebody wants to translate it. That's a perfect example, right? Of a board member advocating on behalf of the organization, putting in their email signature, right? In their personal email. You often see this, including a link to the organization. All right. So that they can raise funds and they can direct people to the organization's website. Other questions, please feel free to ask away. Now, some board members aren't on board with fundraising, and that's the reality. Okay. So if you have questions around that, ask. All right. It takes time, right? This isn't something that's immediate, right? So a give or get, you might hear this phrase, or maybe you've never heard it, which is why I'm going to explain it, right? Give is people personally giving, right? Personally contributing. Though one thing to think about is not everybody can, but they still love your organization and they're passionate and they still might be a good fit. So then they get it. They personally do the work to help secure the funds, whatever it is. Maybe they plan an event. Maybe they are in charge of the end of the year campaign, a community appeal, right? Different ideas that they have. All right. Now, what is a dollar amount? So I've been involved in grassroots organizations where the annual budget is only 50,000 a year. All right. And the threshold is 200 or 250. Ultimately, it's something that it can't just be a random number. There has to be a conversation. What do we think, right, is our board give or get that we feel comfortable? Nobody determines this number but you and your board, which means it's a conversation, right? This is ultimately a conversation, okay? And this information needs to be clear to board members prior to board commitments. So my question for you is and you don't have to say this, right? You don't have to answer this, right? It's a theoretical question, or you answer in your mind, okay? Is what do you make clear to board members right now when it comes to fundraising, right? Is there a give or get? The individual who just got 5 new board members, what was that conversation like, right? How, when you bring in a new board, is it a full group conversation? What are these expectations like? All right. There's no right or wrong answer here. Okay. Now, the right answer for your organization is people are committed, right? They're committed to the process. In terms of dollar amount, it's something that people can do, that you can have success with, but ultimately your organization, right? You have to figure this out. It has to be in alignment with your goals. People have to be able to do this work. Okay. You don't want to give somebody $2,000 and it's not attainable. Otherwise, they'll just quit and never come back. And that's not building out a board or getting ambassadors. Okay. There needs to be transparency in giving requirements and expectations. So if I'm going to join your board, I need to know what is expected of me before I even commit. So if you're going to reach out to me and say, Leah, so-and-so mentioned you might be interested in joining our board. My response to you is, what are the requirements, right? Can you send me all the requirements in the board agreement via email in advance before our conversation, right? Ideally, you have something in writing. A board agreement might be everything that you expect the board to do, right? Give or get. All those responsibilities laid out for them. What does understanding the programs mean? Does it mean coming to a program, showing up to a program, running a program, right? What are the dates of the program? How many hours do I have to give to the program? All those questions that people might have, right? So other things that you might want to think about in your board agreement is literally copying and pasting, maybe potentially this language, right? And putting some numbers and numerics and metrics, right? I will give what is a personally generous annual donation, right? I will actively promote the organization in the community, encourage and support its staff. These are examples. You might need to put some definitions in here, right? That means I will go to 3 community fairs for the organization a year, right? Whatever it is, okay? Can I define what this means? No, not necessarily, because I think it's for your organization to define, right? And here's another great example, right? Not everybody can personally contribute, but they bring in, right? And sometimes that's how you make your board more equitable, right? And inclusive, is by not requiring you have to give this, but if you can get it, right? That's important to be thinking about. You want to get your board members comfortable with fundraising, okay? So they need to practice. You need to provide scripts, right? They need to know how to talk about your organization, all right? Which is often means you need to talk about the priorities with them. You can't necessarily expect people to go off and do if they haven't been trained by you or by somebody else within the organization, because people don't know what to do unless they're told specifically, right? That's where this structure comes in that we'll talk about in a little bit. Every board member should have goals set for them so that there's shared accountability. You set the goals, they set the goals, together you set the goals, as a team you set the goals. All right. So things to think about, right? What makes sense for your organization? How will you decide what you're going to do? All right. How can decisions align with a fundraising plan and organizational goals? Because remember, the first session was about a fundraising plan. Well, your fundraising plan only works if you're able to implement it and if everybody else is on board with it. All right. That's ultimately a goal. Okay. Questions from folks, please feel free to ask away before we go into our breakout rooms. Is there any questions from anybody before we head into our breakout rooms in a few moments? We are going to go into our breakout rooms in a few moments. What we are going to talk about, all right, is this. How do your boards feel about fundraising? Meaning your board members, all right? What is the culture of board giving in your organization? We got a great example before. Somebody secured $50,000, right? That's amazing, all right? And understanding what the culture is important to knowing how to plan for the future, okay? What is currently the culture? Where do you want to go? What do you want to achieve, right? How can you develop fundraising expectations that are in alignment with your board members? And what conversations does your organization have about board giving? What does that look like? This is a lot of questions, all right? We'll have 9 minutes for the breakout rooms. I would love for there to be scribe and leaders, all right? Scribe helps people stay organized, maybe writing down aha moments and sharing them in the Zoom group chat after the breakout room. And a leader, you're all leaders, all right? You're all running your organizations. You're all leaders, all right? In this context, the leader helps to make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak, all right? So this is really important, folks, because my goal for you all is in your fundraising plan, there's something about board giving, all right, and board goals, all right, and it can't just be one person. It's got to be a team of folks, all right? That's the expectation. Sometimes I might say, I want to look at your fundraising plan, but I'm not going to do that to you all right? Okay, so any questions before we get into our breakout rooms? All right. I don't see any. So we are going to send you into your breakout rooms. They're for 9 minutes. Monica?
Okay, I think this might be us in the main room. Just as a reminder, if you haven't already, please.
Sorry, pause. Monica, they're for 9 minutes, not 7 minutes.
Yep, Priya, can you close them really fast so we can adjust the
Get
time?
back, and then we got to do it again. 9 minutes.
Okay. Okay, I think we're all here now. Just a reminder to everyone in the main room, if you're not already in a language channel, please add yourself. There's a little circular emblem at the bottom. And if you click on that, it lets you select English or Spanish. That way we can all communicate. And I know there's a few of us who won't be participating, but if you are going to be part of the conversation, maybe wave or put a little emoji up just so we know who all is participating in this. Edwin, Amanda, Roslyn, wonderful, and Sandy. Awesome. Hi, everyone. Who wants to be scribe and who wants to be leader?
I can scribe. Is anyone else going to participate in the conversation?
I can participate. I can't scribe right now. Sorry. I have too many windows open, and if I close them, I can't finish something later. So
No worries. I can be leader. Edwin, you have your hand raised. Do you want to get us started talking about how your board feels about fundraising?
Ok, bueno, mi nombre es Edwin Hernández. En nuestra organización todavía no tenemos una junta. Estamos, estamos preparando los documentos para seleccionar a los miembros de la junta. Pero yo tengo una pregunta. Nuestra organización es pequeña y estamos trabajando en una localidad donde hay organizaciones comunitarias de mayor trayectoria que nosotros. Y nosotros trabajamos con jóvenes y hemos detectado que uno de los principales riesgos que nosotros cuando hemos contactado con donantes preliminarmente, nos dicen que si hemos conectado con una organización, una de las organizaciones más grandes, y le hemos dicho que sí, y cuando queremos avanzar a otro nivel de coordinaciones, el proceso se cae. Entonces, ¿cuál es la mejor manera de poder? Hemos intentado en varias formas tratar de llegar a la organización más grande para buscar una alianza estratégica. Ellos nos dicen que sí, pero ya hace 2 años y a medida que nosotros seguimos creciendo como organización, pero no vemos que haya un interés del otro grupo de buscar esta integración, pero en el tema de las donaciones nos está afectando. Entonces, ¿cuál sería la recomendación de alguna organización que tiene board que me puedan decir una estrategia de cómo reducir ese riesgo, ¿no?
I have an idea for you, Edwin. I mean, you might have done this already, so I'm just throwing it out. But if you can identify where your programs are aligned with one another and brainstorm how you can support what they do, and in turn, maybe they can support what you do, and it just starts to build that relationship.
Yeah. Edwin, are you working with different youth, like a different population, different community?
Trabajamos con jóvenes provenientes de familias BIPOC y nosotros ya hemos hecho coordinaciones con otra organización de nuestros programas, están alineados, hemos identificado todo eso, hemos tenido reuniones de coordinación, pero personalmente hace 2 años no nos veían, pero ahora que nuestra organización comenzó a crecer, nos los dijeron, ¿no? Nos vieron como una competencia. Yo le dije, bueno, pero no somos competencia, queremos trabajar juntos. Y, yo sentí que de ahí la relación se enfrió más. Entonces, lógicamente que la otra organización es mucho más grande que nosotros y vemos que recibe muchos fondos, mucho soporte, mucha ayuda, y a nosotros nos están marginando. Entonces, nosotros tenemos que hacer doble, triple, cuádruple esfuerzo por conseguir algo pequeño, ¿no?
Yeah, Edwin, that seems very frustrating. I don't know if there is a good solution. I think it's just like continuing to approach donors and like differentiating yourself from them, like explaining what it is that you do that's different than what they are doing, so that you can make the argument that you both deserve support. I don't know. Any other thoughts from the group?
This is Sandy. I don't know if it's helpful, but I hear what you're saying by other groups are larger than you. It's really hard to fight a larger group. If you're a smaller one, you just don't have the resources. And that comes to both representing yourself, the time spent. It's just really hard. So.
Yeah. Well, Sandy, while you're chatting, do you want to take a little bit of time to talk about how your board feels about fundraising?
So my board, it's theoretically, they're 100% behind it. Unfortunately, execution doesn't always sort of help happen as much as you want. So one of the things I've tried to do, and I'll put my camera on. I'm sorry, it's Casual Friday, so I have t-shirts on and my hair back. So, sorry. One of the things that we've tried to do is emphasize to different board members that there are different ways that you can participate in fundraising. Whereas we have some board members who are great at picking up the phone and calling either donors they know or cold calls. Like I have one board member who always brings in everybody more than everybody else. We try to keep notes, and our development stuff are not as good as we could be. But I have another board member that's just not going to do that, but will go do tabling and talk to people about the organization. So I think that my board, I wish they do more fundraising than they do. The intentions are good. It's just keeping the enthusiasm up and keeping them doing it. And we also have a small board. We have 6 right now. So if you don't have full participation of 6, and maybe you have 3 that are active, maybe 4 and 2 doing it in other ways, but more low key, it's not as much as I'd like. But they are enthusiastic about it. They seem to understand the need for it. It's just, you know, all the things you guys are talking about, like talking points and stuff like that. I try to do all of that and to follow up and stuff. So sometimes it's better than others.
Anyone else want to share? Amanda, how have things been with your board?
Yeah, so we have a board of 5 right now, and the expectation, and we had a very clear conversation about this, and I actually should double check to see what's in our bylaws, is that board members are expected to participate in fundraising or give. But I will be honest, we haven't had a really clear conversation about that. So all of this is really good for me to hear again, just to, you know, the question that Leah brought up is just to ask our board again and have that conversation of what at this moment are their understandings of the expectations on them to help fundraise. I think it's time to have that conversation again, because I've actually felt a bit dismayed in the last year with our board, because as opportunities arise, I mean, I even last Giving Tuesday campaign we had, I emailed everyone and said, can you share this with your network? Just spend 20 minutes in emailing even 10 people you think would be willing to give. And I don't think anybody did. So it's sad to me when that kind of easy ask happens and then it's not really met. One of the reasons is our board is really busy. They're all busy people. And so that's hard. They just can't, they don't have the bandwidth. So it's almost like we need to recruit more board members and set expectations differently.
Mm-hmm. I wonder too if like helping create space where like people can see exactly what they need to do, and like there's some like accountability, like maybe it's something you do at a board meeting, like, you know, we're going to take the last 15 minutes and everyone's going to sit on their phone and send it out to 10 people. I don't know, just a thought.
Well, maybe I'll do that for this next Giving Tuesday campaign.
We've done that and it can work. If you do that, I always find we had a consultant come on and give them a pep talk beforehand. And right, we did some prep. We had scripts ready and stuff. And it actually does work, especially if they haven't done that before. We should redo that probably. It kind of like gets them past the fear. And then if you do it and say, okay, over the next 2 to 3 weeks, you know, make all these calls, that actually was one of the more effective ways we did it.
Back to you, Leah.
All right, this is great. Lots of great sharing. Anybody have questions or any aha moments that they want to share, or things that they need to hold themselves accountable to putting in their plans or to getting their boards to do? Anyone wanna? I know that we heard some great ideas, or I was listening in to Sandra and Amanda. Anybody else want to share aha moments or thoughts or ideas or questions? Or does Kim Perla, can you translate for me so I can? I don't know if you saw that chat. But all right, we will continue going. So if you have questions, feel free to ask away. Oh, that is a great question. So, and folks, feel free to share too, sort of what you spend per year on your donation platforms, your marketing, and your events. So a few things to be thinking about. Donation platforms take a percentage, all right? And it's anywhere from 1% to 3% of, it's a transaction fee, okay? So that's like a known cost, right? It's 1 to 3%, whatever platform that you're gonna use. You could spend a lot of money on marketing. You don't necessarily need to, right? If you have volunteers and board members and a committee structure built out that can help you with that. All right. In terms of events, we're going to run through events in a little bit in terms of cost. So I don't want to go through a ton of different numbers right now, because I'm literally in a few moments, we'll talk more about events. But one thing to be thinking about is that ideally when you have boards, your boards are supporting events. All right. So maybe they're connecting you to a venue. So I can't remember who, but somebody's planning an event at a brewery. They are getting the space donated, right? I imagine they're getting a keg donated, maybe some food, I don't know, but they were at least getting the space donated, right? And so that's sort of what you want in terms of support from your board, right? You want your board to help with those things and get those things for you for free, so that you're not spending money on food, so that you're not spending money on space, so that you're not spending money on beverages, right? You want all of that donated so that when people come to the event, they're donating to the event, or they're showing up and you're not spending money there. One other thing for marketing is that obviously Facebook is, most social media you have to pay to market, but Google ad grants you don't, which is a 6-hour training in of itself. So I don't want to like go down this way, but it's worth looking into and thinking about and maybe researching a little bit if your organization, and most of your organizations probably could apply for a Google Ads grant. It's worth it. It's basically what it is if I type in like wilderness experience, Fresno, maybe Ascend would show up, right? Or what's a good, like, right, you type certain things up and your organization would show up with an ad that you don't have to pay for because it's a Google Ads grant, and you get $10,000 a month in free advertising. It's a lot of work to maintain and manage, but you can recruit volunteers, and it's just free advertising on Google Ads. It's the things that you see at the top. Like if you type in plumber, the thing that you will see at the top is an ad. But if you type in, for example, wilderness volunteer experience Fresno or something like that, right? If that's, you might see your organization come up. Okay, so it's a great way to volunteer. It's a great way to get volunteers. It's a great way to promote. It's really good if you're location-based or place-based and you're working on specific projects within a specific location of the country. All right. And I apologize, I have a typo in the word fundraise. All right, so who typically volunteers to fundraise? So no, you can be approved for a Google ad grant if you are a nonprofit, if you are not a university, or you are not a church, like a faith-based. So they exclude faith-based organizations. They exclude universities, like, for example, right, Berkeley cannot get a free Google Ads grant, right? Well, that's right. They have the money to pay for the Google Ads grant. Or, think of the biggest Cedars-Sinai Medical Center can't get, that's a nonprofit hospital in Southern California, right? They couldn't get a Google Ads grant, but small organizations like you all, that's who the Google Ad grant program wants to give Google Ads to. All right. So just something to think about. It's a big, big task. I want to be clear, so I don't want to go too far into it. But when the marketing person asked me, or when the question came up, it reminded me of that. So, okay, yeah. That makes sense if you're connected to UC Davis. Yes, that makes sense. Okay, so who typically volunteers to fundraise for an organization? It's people with an affinity, right? So it's going to be hard to ask somebody to fundraise if they don't have a connection to your organization or they haven't volunteered. All right. So people who are going to fundraise are current volunteers, alumni, board members, program participants, parents, people impacted by your mission. All right. So that's what you want to be thinking about. All right. In addition, right, I think it could be really helpful to grab a Google document, a shared Google document, and you and your board start to put names to these categories, right? Think of 5 program participants. There's a person on this training who runs a summer program. And they're in Seattle area, right? And they want to, I'm not sure who it is. Maybe Aurora can help me remember. And they want to make it a year-long program. Your past participants, right? They're your best advocates because they've been through your program. All right. So one goal could be, as part of your fundraising plan, not to add more to your to-do list, but literally write out this in categories in a Google sheet and spend a week and a half or 2 weeks putting names to each category. And you do it and ask all of your board members to do it. All right. That could be something that you put in your fundraising plan potentially. All right. Potentially. And this is really thinking through how you're going to build out your fundraising team, right? How you're going to achieve those goals. Okay. So in addition to thinking about who might fundraise, you want to create the structure for people to fundraise. Okay. So you want to build in the structure for fundraising to happen in your organization beyond just the board members. Okay. And you need a willing group to do this work. Okay. So when we go back to this question, right, this task that might be on your to-do list, you want to write down people. And then at some point, you want to maybe circle or square or whatever, denote who might actually be interested in helping with fundraising. Or if I asked them, right? So that's things to be thinking about. Not everyone is comfortable with fundraising. All right. And that's just the reality. So part of your job, right, is to help people get comfortable with fundraising. All right. And you have to take the time to train and build the culture of giving, and also frame and explain the why, right? Framing and explaining the why can be really helpful for folks. The more you explain and frame, the more likely somebody else will want to be involved in that. Somebody mentioned, right, circle of influence. This is very similar to that. So yes, share that document. All right, okay, wait. So, right, this could be considered your circle of influence, right? And then you also have to name people. You have to put names and email addresses and phone numbers and the time that it takes to reach out. It's also considered power mapping in some ways. So you want to be thinking about, once you have these people, once you spent the time to potentially identify, then you have to put them into a structure, right? What might these structures look like? Maybe a fundraising committee, maybe a gala committee, maybe an events committee, maybe a sponsorship committee, right? And each of these committees, right, do different things and have different responsibilities, all right? And the more volunteers you have, all right, the more likely you can have more committees. So maybe right now you just have your board. Often what you see is you have a board and then maybe you get a fundraising committee, all right? Sometimes there's overlap, sometimes there's not, all right? And your fundraising committee could be maybe a board member, maybe some volunteers, maybe past participants, right? People in your sphere of influence, right? Or people who volunteered with you all who said they want to help, or people who responded to your request for help and they always show up and help. And you're like, oh, maybe I should get them more involved and give them a role, right? So do you need all of these committees? No, but I do think it could be really helpful to say, all right, you know, we're working on building out our board in 2022. And then in 2023, we want to build out a fundraising committee. And we want to have 8 individuals on the fundraising committee or 10 individuals on the fundraising committee. And we want them to be maybe from these categories, right? Potentially, all right? Things to think about. You can't build out all these committees right away. It's a lot of work, all right? So for the last grassroots organization that I was very involved with, like in terms of timeline, it took us about 2 years. So 2 years after we built out our board, which took 6 months, it took 2.5 years to build out all these committees and actually functioning. All right. So be realistic about your timelines, the things that takes, the amount, like what you can do now, right? I think it's really important for folks to always be realistic. All right. So in thinking about those committees, all right, the way in which they're structured, right? They serve at the pleasure of the organization, right? They serve the organization. Sometimes with volunteers, right? Everybody's got their own.
Hearing a Spanish interpretation on the main channel.
Okay, I'll pause.
Hold on. Okay, is it back on the Spanish channel? Okay. Thanks, Leah. I think we can go ahead.
Okay. Sounds good. Oh, sometimes okay. So these committees serve at the pleasure of the organization. All right. So sometimes with volunteers, right, they want to do certain things and they want to do it their way, but that's not how committees work, right? Committees serve at the pleasure of the organization. Okay. And it's important to remember and remind folks of that. All right. So your organization, ultimately your board, or maybe one person and then approved by the board, okay, they determine what the goals are of the fundraising committee, the gala committee, the events committee, the sponsorship committee, right? So they determine the goals. And those goals are probably highlighted in a fundraising plan, hopefully, potentially. Tasks are given out, right? And maybe there's tasks connected to each goal, right? So if we have a goal to build out a sponsorship committee, maybe the sponsorship committee's goal, once it's built out, is to secure 5 sponsorships from organizations, 5 different organizations, right? What would the task be? The task might be brainstorming a list, right, of potential sponsors that would be a good fit, right? And then putting dates to those tasks. All right. Then what's the meeting structure? Are there meetings? It's good if committees meet because that holds people accountable, right? Who's a committee lead, right? The committee lead maybe supports the committee, reports to you. That might be the structure, right? And then what's the length of service? So often I think that finding good board members are people who've served on committees. So this is how you build out your leadership pipeline. You have a board, you have committees, you have volunteers. Volunteers flow into the committees, then the committee members flow into the board, right? And you might not be there right now, but as you build out the structure, you can get there, all right? What helps with this structure is that when you have trained committee members, it's so much easier for them to serve on a board because they have the context for why you're doing certain things. So when I ran the small grassroots organization, the first 6 months that I ran the organization, our board was all over the place, right? Some people didn't even connect to the mission. They were just, right, they were there, right? And then as we got volunteers, they got onto committees. And then the committee members who were doing great work became committee leads. Then they became board members. And then eventually we had the right board members serving in the right roles. And sometimes it just takes a while. All right. So other things to think about. Committees are the leadership pipeline for your organization. All right. So what might make sense for your organization in terms of committees, right? The other thing to be thinking about is committee members can train other committee members. All right. So that means that you have, and you see this a lot in community and grassroots organizations, right? People training other people, delegating the work so everyone can support, right? Because not everything can be done by one person, okay? So you want to make sure that committee members can train other committee members. So that might mean that your committee members have to get trained on this information by you or by other board members. Maybe you send them this recording, right? I'm fine with that. If Aurora's fine with that, there we go, right? So things to be thinking about, right? And then also really important, the task that a committee does should help the organization, not impede organizational progress, all right? So if your committees aren't serving you, maybe it's time to rethink the committees, all right? So if your committees aren't serving you, it might be time to rethink your committees or at least have a conversation with board members, because ultimately when you have just volunteers doing this work, you want to make sure that everybody's there to help and support and to make sure that the work is getting done. All right. Any questions before we continue? I'm looking at our Zoom group. I'm looking at faces and I'm looking at the chat. All right. So other things to be thinking about, right? When you're getting volunteers to serve on your committees, they help you with peer-to-peer fundraising. All right. Some of which we're going to talk about next time. They help you by serving on committees. They train other volunteers. All right. Other things that, oh, Perla, other things that they could do is, I mention this because you often see this with really small grassroots organizations. Correct. Not all volunteers are necessarily members of the board. Absolutely. You don't, right? So that's a really good question. And if anybody else has folks that have volunteers serving on committees, please feel free to chat. So I'm going to answer two questions. So the one that came in from Edwin was not all volunteers necessarily are members of the board. Correct. Because you want board members that are the correct fit. All right. And so putting people on committees allows you to get a sense of their commitment. All right. And it allows you to get a sense of what they will do when they eventually serve on the board, if they're the right fit, if they believe in what you're doing, right? You want to think of a board member as, you know, sort of the highest level in terms of leadership. All right. So the first stage might be they show up to volunteer at an event, right? Or cleanup day or whatever it is. And then maybe they serve on a committee as a volunteer. All right. And then maybe they are in charge of a committee. And then you realize they've been working on this committee for 6 months or a year. I think they would be a great board member. That's the ultimate, right? Like, I think that's always an ultimate goal, because then you know if they're the right fit. And board members have a massive responsibility for your organization. All right. And so it's important to make sure that you have the right board members in the right role. All right. So that's really important to be thinking about. So an affinity group. So I mentioned this because an affinity group is, you often see affinity groups with conservation groups or environmental groups or libraries. All right. Organizations that are really small, that have maybe been around for a long period of time. All right. You often see them referred to as friends of. All right. Friends of the blah, blah, blah. Friends of, right. So you will see this with like a small library in town. All right. Or you might see this for a small environmental or conservation group. All right. So sometimes what happens is these may be groups that are raising money on behalf of the organization. Okay. So an affinity group might be, and I mentioned this because last time we talked about how you could potentially leverage young professionals in different groups to support your organization. Sometimes affinity groups are built out in support of an organization. Their sole purpose is to network and raise money for the organization, right? But they might not be a board member of the organization. They might just be a group that is supporting an organization. All right. Sometimes you see this also with universities and medical centers, which are very interesting because you also see this with really small conservation groups. All right. Which are the complete end of the spectrum, right? An organization that might be a grassroots environmental group that has a budget of 50,000 or 100,000, and then a university. So I mention it in case any of you have ever heard of it. For a small, and I see a question coming in, so I'm reading the question. For a small organization that has 2 programs running in parallel, how many board members? So I think it depends on your past history and what you've done in the past, right? So sometimes we think the more board members we get, the more we're going to raise. But you, Edwin, you have to manage all those board members, or somebody does, right? And managing 15 people is not easy. All right. So things to be thinking about are, you know, look at the past to help you, and like, look at your past work. All right. Look at what you've done in the past. So if you've only raised 30,000, and I guess, you know, Edwin, I have a next question for you is, what did you raise last year? And how many board members did you have? Right. And maybe it's not getting more board members. Maybe it's getting more structure. So maybe it's adding a fundraising committee, because you could add more board members who aren't necessarily helping you in the way that you want to be helped, right? Or you could get more board members and it takes so long to train them to get them to where they need to go. So thinking about the structure of how you train, right? Because the committee structure that I mentioned to you before is in part training people on how to be a board member. If they serve really well on your fundraising committee, and they hit their goals and their metrics and the work that they're supposed to be doing, that clues you in to make sure that they would be a good board member. All right. So the next thing to be thinking about is how to recruit. All right. So this is how to recruit people for committee members. All right. Because I really believe that you need to build out this pipeline for your board. All right. You can't ask somebody who has no connection or affinity or history with your organization to serve on the board. They're not going to be able to necessarily contribute in the way that you need them to, unless, of course, I mean, I'm giving you one example, right? Not everything is black and white. So there might be the gray area. Maybe, right? One of you has a board member and you're based in Fresno and they're moving to Washington, where that other organization is located, and they want to serve in a local organization, and they already served in your organization. So they have context of, right, grassroots environmental organizations, and they've done this before, right? That might be an example, but it's not always that case. So I just sort of want to be clear. The more you train, the more you prepare somebody to serve as a board member, the better they will serve your organization. All right. So hopefully I answered. That was a very long answer to Edwin's question. And like, I can't give you a specific, this is the number. All right. But I would be interested in the question I asked is, what did you raise last year and how many board members did you have? Because I think that can help you answer your own question. Okay, so how to recruit. So I think it's helpful to tap into your core volunteers, right? To share on your channels how one might serve, all right? To continually host recruitment meetings with anyone who is on your list to serve, to also pick up the phone and say, you know, Leah, we are hosting a recruitment meeting for this committee on this date. Would you be interested in attending? Right? We'd love for you to serve on this committee. You have to call people, and often you have to, you know, call 3 times, 4 times, not just once, but you have to call until they say yes, right? If they're a volunteer, right? Okay, if they say no, then you know that they're not interested, but you want to get a hold of them till they say yes, right? You want to make sure that you pick up the phone. An email doesn't necessarily count, right? I have 200,000 unread emails in my personal inbox. So I don't really think email counts. Picking up the phone and calling is really important. All right. So that's something to be thinking about. Yes, Eric. And you should be able to deliver this presentation to them. All right. And you make it connected to your work, right? That's the goal. So also asking volunteers to bring a friend to serve on a committee is really important. All right. Okay. I also, joking aside, is that people don't always watch recordings. So one thing to be thinking about is, what do you think is absolutely essential from this training, right? And share that information with your board members as opposed to expecting them to watch a recording, because most people don't. So if there's maybe share the deck with them. All right. But don't expect people to sit and watch. One thing I will say is think about what's most relevant and share that information and ask your board members, ask your committee members what they think. All right. Because, right, the goal of this is to get them on board. And yes, we do share the slides and recording. So yeah, take a friend out for coffee. Yes, take a friend out for coffee, for sure. For sure. Okay, so I'm also a big believer in phone banking. So it doesn't sort of matter the purpose of why you're doing phone banking. I think picking up the phone is really hard and it's boring sometimes. So if you can make it fun for your volunteers, I think that's good. All right. So how do we make phone banking fun? Well, maybe we ask a bunch of our volunteers over to our house and we tell them to bring their cell phones and we have pizza or soup or some sort of food and we feed them, right? And we say, everybody's got to make some phone calls. All right. And you would be surprised the number of calls that people can make when you feed people or give them treats or whatever it is. And you say, everybody's here from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. at my house, and we're getting this done. All right. So I'm involved in a grassroots organization, and every March, and I always have to do the math because I think I've already told you this many, many times, but every March they have 500 volunteers across the country and they all have to call 25 people. That's 12,500 phone calls happening in one day. All right. But you don't necessarily need 500 volunteers. Maybe you bring over 8 volunteers and you each have to call 25 people. All right. And the work sometimes gets done if you're doing it in groups, more likely than if you say, hey, Leah, go make these phone calls. And I don't know, Leah's busy with everybody's a volunteer, right? So it's hard to sometimes get things done. And sometimes it's more fun to do this together. All right. So that's something to think about. Another thing to do is if you're doing a pop-up event before, all right, yeah, you could even do it virtually, right? Totally fine. Do it virtually. Everybody sees each other. And maybe you send care packages for making phone calls to people's houses. Candy. I don't even know, right? Encouragement, words of encouragement, right? This can totally be done virtually also, right? You can all be on Zoom and say, let's make phone calls for 15 minutes. And then let's be on the Zoom together. How did that go? Right? What worked well? What did we do well? Right? And you break it out that way. Yes, great point. You can also do it. The goal is to make the calls. So however you're going to get the calls done, really, really important. And this is great. Yes. Thank you cards are also really important. So when you make a call and let's say you get a commitment from somebody, whether it's a phone call, right? There's many reasons why we do phone calls. We do phone calls to thank people. We do phone calls to ask for donations. We do phone calls to get people to volunteer, whatever it is, right? If somebody says yes, then sending them a handwritten note card goes really far in terms of cultivating with that individual. So one thing I think can be really helpful is if you have people who are sort of the primary doers in your organization, giving them like a stack of 50 or 25 branded note cards and suggesting that they get through them in a certain period of time. That can be really helpful, right? And a note card, a handwritten note card is very different than a receipt for a donation. All right. We don't often get snail mail. Maybe we get bills, but I think a handwritten note card can go really far. I used to, when I worked at the small organization where I started out with 50 on my desk. And my goal was to always get through the stack of 50 by the end of the month. So if you think that that's helpful, totally go for it. You always have to be thinking, how would this work in my organization? All right. So a little bit more about phone banking. It could be good to theme the phone banking, right? We're doing it end of the year contributions or selling tickets to our event at the brewery. If you're selling tickets, I don't know, right? Just an example. You want to create goals, and because then you can look back and see, all right, on November 1st, we did phone calls. This is what we achieved, right? Volunteer scripts. If they're in their own homes doing phone calls, you need volunteer scripts, all right? And then set a date, see how it goes, test what works, right? You want to make sure that you get volunteers involved who care about what you're doing, all right? because the volunteers that you get involved in this and who show up, right? They might be a committee lead. They might be a board member. This is examples of a theme. All right. Ultimately, AFP, sorry, I'm looking at the chat. So I can't do two things at once. Okay, so phone banking. So there's events, there's end of the year campaign, and there's volunteer initiatives. These are example themes. Okay, but ultimately you have to choose the theme. The theme aligns with your fundraising goals, your fundraising plans, right? Whatever's in your fundraising plans, you have to then make sure that you pull a theme that connects to the plans, because everything should be interconnected. All right. Whatever you're doing should be in alignment with your fundraising plan. All right. Because everything goes to, right, serve the purpose of your fundraising plans and your goals. Okay. So these are some examples that you could use. Other questions, please feel free to ask away. So many great comments in the chat. For those that don't know, AFP is it's an organization for folks who want to learn more about fundraising, though I will say most of the people in it work for very large institutions, right? So museums, I was a member of AFP when I worked at a hospital. So hospitals, medical centers, museums, arts organizations, Habitat, Boys and Girls Club, Girl Scouts, organizations like that. And it's a wealth of knowledge and resources. And they have some pretty active chapters in the Bay Area, right? Sacramento, Bay Area, for sure. Central Coast. I know some of the folks in the Central Coast Bay Area, or one. So they're great resource. So let's talk a little bit about events, because they are really helpful for your organization. All right. It's a way to pull people in and to promote the work that you're doing. It helps you recruit volunteers. It helps build your community, which ultimately might be your donor base in the future, right? It highlights the work that you're doing. Now, there's lots of different types of events, all right? So I'm going to give you some examples, and you have to think about what's relevant for my organization, all right? Not every event works, all right? Not every event makes sense to do, okay? Because why? They all take work, a lot of work, okay? And if you don't have enough volunteers, you might not be able to do an event that you want to do. So you need to plan in advance, right? And you need to have a point person. You need to delegate out the task. Use a run a show, and I'm going to give you an example of what a run a show is, okay? Don't expect everyone to follow through when you're planning an event, unfortunately. And that's the reality. And I say this because you don't want to bite off more than you can chew. Right? Like you don't want to say, let's do this. It might be a stretch, and you're stretched thin already. All right. Also, if you want, I'm sure this number is even more skewed because it's really hard to get people to show up physically to things these days. All right. So if you want 100 people at your event, you might have to invite 1,000 people. All right. Like that just might be the reality. All right. And that is for a paid event, right? So if it's free, it's wildly different, right? And that's why sometimes having partners and, having goals of board members, you have to bring 5 people, right? Because that can help you get to your goal, all right? This was always my rule of thumb when I planned in-person fundraisers, is if I wanted 100 people there, I needed to invite 1,000 people. Now, maybe we didn't have 1,000 people on our email list. So how are we going to get to that 1,000? So these are some examples of events that you might do. All right. If you are a rural organization or if you're grassroots, Phantom event is a fake event. It's a no event. I'm going to explain it to you in a second. It's like a no-show chicken dinner. Soup night might be gathering at somebody's home, right? And everyone brings a bowl and you provide the soup, right? Or maybe you do a cookout in a wilderness area that you have access to, all right? Or a park and a land tour, or one organization that I've seen I live in Colorado, so there's a lot of open space areas. And one organization did like bagels and headshots. So they had somebody do professional headshots in the open space area, and they brought bagels, and and somebody donated their time to take the professional headshots for people's LinkedIn profiles. And people who showed up to that event they just needed a headshot, and they plucked down the $75 for the headshot in this very nice area that had aspen trees, like with the yellow pretty aspen trees. So sometimes the people that might come to your event are really different. Block parties are very fun. All right, there we go. So other things to be thinking about is how to get volunteers involved in events, right? Again, this is figuring out roles and creating structure, right? Who helps with sponsors? Who does the phone banking to get people to show up? The marketing, the logistics, the day of event support, right? What does that look like? Everybody has to have a role. So this is pop-up events. And I'm saying this because who was it, Amanda? Right. I'm trying to convince Amanda to do a pop-up event, I think, in Memorial Day weekend. That's the goal, right? So this could potentially be, right, on location in a certain area when there's a lot of people there, right? And maybe you're showcasing what you're doing. You have a table with information. You have activities to engage kids, right? And maybe a QR code, which everybody is so used to, right, to collect info. All right. I'm now remembering in Labor Day, I was at the trailhead near Crested Butte, Colorado. So it was a wilderness area. It was not a national park. It was a wilderness area. And there were so many tables of random like just tons of different organizations sharing information, right? So that could be something that you do as an example. So this is one that I like. It's not something that you can do every year, but it's an easy one to do. A no-show chicken dinner. So basically, you ask volunteers to give 3 to 5 names, right, of family, neighbors, and friends, maybe anyone who's ever contributed to your organization. You create a really nice invitation, not on copy paper, but on nice paper, all right? And you hand address envelopes, and you list every single board member on the invitation, and you sort of make a joke of it, like a no-show chicken dinner. It's on this date. You sit in front of your TV, you grab your favorite beverage, and you ask them to donate to your organization, $50 or $100. But like, there is no event. All right. It's sort of this fun, jokey thing. It won't work every year. All right. Which is really, it's the invitation. Like, you have to play into the invitation, and you have to list everybody that's committed to it, because ultimately, like, when somebody gets the invitation, they need to see a name they recognize. All right. Because if I get an invitation to a no-show chicken dinner and I don't recognize a name, I'm going to throw it away. So there might need to be like 50 people listed on the invite. And then you ask for not $5, but maybe sort of $25, $50, right? And this is sort of an example of postage, right? And this is not an every year strategy. So maybe you do a tour of a park or a land, and you organize a nature hike, and it's a donation based or flat fee. That could be an example, right? You could do a curated event, not for your volunteers or donors, but maybe for a young professionals group that wants to get outdoors, right, in your space. It's just an example. All right. You have to think about, what might work for you. All right. because all of these events on some level, right? You have to tweak, you have to align, you have to think about, what is relevant to us, right? Or you might want to do the, barbecue outdoors, right? More traditional. Okay. So you just want to be thinking what aligns with our organization. You always need to do a run a show because there's a lot of details that go into things, right? If you're doing a block party, who is organizing the block party, right? Who's getting vendors, right? Who's getting food? Who's getting beverages? What's the activity? Tables and chairs, right? Who's getting the permit to close down the block, right? That's a lot, right? So who are doing all of those things? So, okay, feel free to respond, folks, in terms of virtual events. And I will share with Aurora, or we'll just upload it into Box. So we actually do a lot of training on virtual events. And we'll just share a presentation that we've done on virtual events and you can look into them. One thing that I think can be really good is having some things pre-recorded in a video, because ultimately a virtual event depends on your internet speed. And if you, the host, have really bad internet and you're going to a wilderness area, you might not have great internet. And that's just the reality. So sometimes what you might see is a pre-recorded video that's played to showcase the work, or maybe some slides and photos. And ultimately, right, the virtual event depends on you picking up the phone and asking people for money to show up. And you can't necessarily depend on people to donate in the virtual event, because if they don't have great internet or they're watching from a phone, they might not be able to click on the link. All right. So virtual events work, and they take a lot of work on the front end to make sure that people are going to donate. And because you can't expect people to just donate at the event. We'll also share that resource, because that's a 4-hour conversation in of itself. All right. And I don't want to go down that train. Okay. And if it's not relevant to everyone, so we'll get you the resources. So who to include in a run a show? I mean, everybody, right? Staff, volunteers, sponsors, vendors, partners, VIPs, right? And other things that you might need to be thinking about in your run a show is a diagram and a floor plan and a venue address. And if you're doing this in your wilderness area, like the actual address of how to get there, because anybody who's ever gone hiking in a natural area anywhere, right, knows that the address isn't always the place of where it is, right? So making sure people actually know how to get there is important, right? Supplies needed, right? Know that if you're doing something not in a building with supplies, you're going to have to bring it all, right? Phone numbers, backup plans for your backup plan, event promotion timeline, right? If you want 100 people there, how long is it going to take you to get those 100 people there to show up, to commit, to pay? Probably a few months, right? These things take time in your run of show. Ooh, someone did a live cooking class for plant-based foods. Yes. Experiences online in virtual events, they work, right? So that's a great idea as well. All right, we are going to head into a breakout room. All right, this one's going to be for 10 minutes. All right, and this is going to be our last breakout room, and then we'll close out with a closing slide after the breakout room. So this will give you 1 extra minute. All right, so 10 minutes. All right, and what volunteers, so things to think about, what volunteers structures discussed are relevant to you, right? That was the, committees and the different committees, and then getting people to serve on the board, right? Because a board position is the highest level of commitment. How do you use events as a way to fundraise or build support? What has worked or not worked for you related to fundraising events? And what are your event plans for 2022 or 2023? So we will be in our breakout rooms for 10 minutes. All right. Any questions before we head into our breakout rooms? All right. Tech support, make sure we do 10 minutes for the breakout rooms. And we are sending everyone into their breakout rooms.
I'm muted. Hi, everyone. Roselyn, would you like to get us started? Just because I know you didn't get a chance to talk at the last breakout. Anything about volunteer structure or events that was speaking to you?
Oh my goodness, she was saying so much that was really, oh, sorry, my daughter's talking to me. Okay, sorry. Yeah, no, so much was very interesting, down to all the different creative ways to think about how to engage both people in participating in fundraising, and also how to get just the goal setting. I thought was really important in terms of everybody who's participating, whether it's the board. We're a cooperative, so we don't have a typical board structure. So I was trying to translate, the advice into that space where we have cooperative families, and we have 20 plus cooperative families. So there's actually a lot of people to set, that we could say we all, and we have done this where we set a financial goal for everybody, and that's really helped. So I think just really one of the things that I'll take away is really thinking about what those annual goals are, and also small event goals as well if we're doing events. But yeah, there's a lot. I really want to go back and look at the slides and the recording too, to do some takeaways.
You all have a big event, don't you?
Yeah, we have the Sayal one. It's a dance-a-thon. And we pivoted to an online version during the pandemic, and then this year we went back in person. And actually, in person we found that it's a little trickier to get more people to come now than it is to do the online, because you can reach to so many people across the country, in so many other spaces in a way that you can't with an in-person event. So they have really very different goals, I think, when you have an online versus an in-person fundraiser. And I think that's something we have to contend with when we plan for the next one, because there's the in-person event, which will build a lot of community, but it's just less people there to draw resources, to invite resources from. But it was really a healing and wonderful space to be together again and to experience that. So I also appreciate the comment at the end that, online events are really good too. And being an outdoor program, we really wanted to get back to being outdoors and in person, and are finding that, at least I'm finding that we need to sort of revisit or rethink what our online presence could be, because I think we discovered some things about what we could do in that space, and but it's not where we started out as an organization, and so we have to define that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Have you guys thought, after coming back to in person, about incorporating some kind of hybrid version of it? I don't know what that would look like, or if that's even possible. But
yeah. Well, the year before last summer, we did our hybrid camp, and by far for the kids, the in-person was much more preferred. And same this year, so we went full in person this year, but we had a lot of success with sort of the online learning pilot that we did a couple years ago, sort of in between the two summers. And yeah, it's a different kind of planning, and having video segments now that we maybe don't necessarily have, because we didn't do an in-person an online based program this past summer. Those aren't readily accessible. So there's some production that's needed, or if it's not, we don't want to do a heavy lift, we have to think in advance, like, okay, how can we make this material become something that we can put into a virtual space? Otherwise, I think it's a different pathway to planning curriculum, or planning how to get our work out there and how to do our work. But I think there's definitely an interest, but it wasn't part of our strategic plan that we sort of defined before the pandemic. The pandemic just opened up a completely different way to think about how we might have to or want to do our work. And so
right, you're still building a plan.
Mm-hmm.
Anyone else have any events that they do with their organization already, or event ideas that you've considered?
I will contribute here. So we started doing this event called, and it's an all ages prom, and it's a mountain prom, and it was like the most incredible, like we weren't expecting the success we had, but I think in the end, what we think is that people love the idea of getting dressed up and going to see live music and then supporting something. And then the prom has all these fun gimmicks, like we had a photo booth and, you know, prom king and queen, but we pitched it in a way that people could vote by buying tickets, which then contributed to fundraising. So of course, like you could like buy somebody's election essentially. But we did all these fun gimmicks, and it was packed wall to wall with people. We just weren't expecting that. So we had this incredible momentum and had a prom committee, and it was even to the point where, as the executive director of the organization, I had nothing to do with it. It was just happening. It had its own momentum. And then COVID happened. And so, you know, this is like a really interesting conversation to be having right now, because I don't really know how to answer some of these questions anymore. It's changed. Everything has changed. And I recently, just in the last week or two, reached out to everyone who was involved with prom, and we had about 40 volunteers for that event. And I had a decent response. I'd say 10 or 12 people responded saying they'd like to help again, but only a few of them would commit to being on a prom committee. And so it's hard to just, you know, I emailed them directly. I felt like it was a more personal request that way. And yeah, it's just, how do you get people to commit that kind of time? You know, I gave them a parameters of like, it'd probably be 2 to 4 hours a week for the, you know, 3 months prior to the event. And so I'm just actually, we're trying to rebuild all that momentum, and we're still struggling after the last few years. And I really love the idea that came up in this session around making space with our board, like stopping our meeting 15 minutes early. That actually sounds like something I could do with my board. And then giving them that list that Leah provided about brainstorming who in their lives that we can network with. And at least maybe just in that first round, just writing down names, like kind of forcing us all to do it at the same time. And then maybe another session with our board is maybe hosting, you know, having everyone come over for dinner and doing that phone call ask, you know, providing a really good pitch for them and doing it together. So those are both things that I think we can manage right now, because we just need to rebuild that momentum. So it's nice to hear some ideas around that. Otherwise, I feel kind of at a loss. Just everyone's different now. Just virtual world is different. Getting in person is different.
Yeah, I think that's very true, Amanda. I've heard that from a lot of folks. And I think it's unrealistic to expect us to just be like back to normal. Like we're recovering. There, you know, there's been a huge amount of volunteers kind of falling away. People aren't as open and eager and back into the world as they used to be. It's just going to take time to rebuild. And like, you know, you've got to kind of give yourself that space and be like, yeah, that is just what it is. We're going to have to try something else for the time being, and we're going to have to build back up to it. Like it's just not something we can dive exactly into where we were pre-2020. It sucks.
Yeah.
Tom, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I just want to echo what everybody else is saying about COVID changing the world we work in. We used to have really fun chicken in the barrel dinners and live auctions and silent auctions and all that kind of fun stuff that you did together once a year, just, you know, to get together and spend some money on the organization and have some fun. And, you know, we just can't do that anymore. Pretty much all the volunteers in my organization are, you know, gray haired. We're 60 or older, and we can't get together and we live in a county that's 40% unvaccinated. So it's like, you don't do indoor things at all anymore with other people. So we're still looking for those kinds of new opportunities to do that.
Yeah, definitely. Maybe it means a different approach, like trying a different kinds of events, something that's a little smaller scale.
Yeah, we did online auction instead, and it was fun. It wasn't the same sort of, it wasn't as successful, and it wasn't as fun. It's just.
Yeah, I hear that. We tried to do our stuff online as well. And, there are some benefits. There is a little bit of broader reach, but it's also not the same.
Yeah.
I think we're wrapping up. Take it back.
Yes. One thing I will say about virtual events is I always like to think of them as a way to engage people for the first time who may not know about your organization, right? So if you have cool photos of programs, or if you have, like a short videos, and when I say short videos, I mean 1 minute, 2 minute, 3 minutes, right? Because videos can lag and nobody wants to sit and watch a lagging video with bad internet speed. All right. So that's something to think about. And the best virtual events that I've helped produce or lead have been short, 30 minutes, right? 30 minutes, maybe 45 minutes at most. And some of them have a lot of interaction, right? So maybe you do trivia and you make the trivia about the wilderness area that you are, right, managing or raising money for, or perhaps you do, some sort of game or activity that you organize, and they need to be fast paced. So there might be a 1 to 2 minute welcome and intro, and then there might be a slideshow with a short video, and then you might do the 10 to 15 minute, activity, and then like 10 to 15 minute Q&A of sort of what you've done. But the best ones I've participated in are shorter, much shorter than an in-person event, 45 minutes to 30 minutes. Just on that note, because I heard the conversations going. So things to be thinking about are, don't compare yourself to other organizations. All right. I do want to say, right, don't compare yourself to other organizations. Do what makes sense for your goals, capacity, and volunteer base. It is really easy to compare and say, oh, but they got that and they did this. And my question is then like, well, why, right? Like, what work did they do, right? If somebody is doing something, they put in the work to get there. And right, everybody has to put in the work to get to where they want to go. So don't do the comparison, because it doesn't serve anybody well. Just want to remind folks. And then remind yourself, right? Events are a lot of work. So what makes sense for your organization? I personally think a no-show chicken dinner would be easier than a virtual event, and you might make the same amount, maybe, right? Now, one thing to be thinking about is, can you do that every year? No, because the funniness of it wears off, right? So it might work once every other year, right? And then you want to make sure to create structure for people to support and volunteer. All right. So those are some reminders. And then questions, please. I'm reading the chat just to make sure I'm not missing anything. So if folks have questions, please feel free to ask away. We are coming to a close. All right. So we are coming to a close. I am leaving time for questions. If people have questions, I also realize that folks have many places to be and things to do. So if you have to log off, please feel free. If you have questions, also feel free to type them into the chat. I'm going to let Aurora close out, because I think maybe like a minute, you might have some closing things to say.
Yeah, I just want to invite everyone to fill out the evaluation survey. It helps give us some ideas about upcoming convening topics, and helps us plan better trainings. And we do have one more, so we do read them and adjust. So yeah, thank you all. It's wonderful to see you. And I know Leah has a couple more minutes, but not too much time. We do have another session. If there are extra questions, we can collect them and address them next week.
Great. So if folks have questions, please feel free to ask away. If not, thank you all so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Hi, Leah. I have a quick question. It's unrelated, but I don't want to take time if someone's specific to what we just talked about.
Feel free. Ask.
Okay.
Wait, somebody said comment on my message, and I don't know who they're asking to comment. Aurora, I don't know. So, okay, ask your question, Amanda.
So our board is in some big need of an annual retreat. It's been a while, and a lot of the things you touched upon today would be really, really great if they could revisit with us. We've done this sort of thing before, but it's been a few years, and it's starting to look like we need to do it like maybe once every 2 years. And I'm not the person to do it. As the executive director, I think they would receive it better from a professional facilitator and certain things. Obviously, we can do our own work groups within a board retreat. But anyway, long question short is, if you are a resource that we can call upon to hire to facilitate some conversations in that board retreat, or if there are resources like that that we could look up.
Yes, just send an email to Tech Support's gonna email you with our email address.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Share that info as well.
And then I see somebody with their hands raised. And Tech Support, can you make sure to text Amanda the email? Someone with their hand raised. And if also really helpful, I have a limited amount of time. So if folks have questions, I would type them into the chat so that I could see them, process them, and also answer everybody's questions. But somebody had their hand raised.
Yes, it was me. It was Gabriella.
Oh, okay.
And thank you, whoever answered it in the chat. The question or the comment that I made was, we had planned before the pandemic, we had planned an event called Race, Class, and Climate Change, and Staten Island, New York is very alienated from one another in their political views and their racial views, etc. And so it was going to be highly sensitive, and I did not want, once COVID happened, I did not want to take it virtually, and I wanted to be in person so that we could feel the energy in the room and the body language, etc. So I just wanted to comment on that. And
Yeah.
I think Aurora commented.
Oh, Aurora did. So yeah, I mean, yes. Well, yeah. And Aurora's definitely correct. There's certain things that are hard to do in person than online, right? And if you're like, so it depends on the level of experience that a facilitator may have when it comes to facilitating that type of conversation. So ultimately, it's what does the group need in terms of being in person, being virtual, and being present? And then what type of facilitator do you have? And what's the facilitator's comfort level with that topic and doing that topic in person versus virtual? I mean, a complete side note, I train virtually on trauma-informed facilitation. I have never done that topic in person. I've never trained that topic in person. And one might think that that is a topic that would be done in person, and yet I've never done it in person. So, sometimes you can find the right person to facilitate that style of event. It doesn't necessarily mean that your participants want to do that virtually, right? So that's you might be able to find the person in your area, but it's probably better, right, to wait until people want to go in person. I don't know. There's so many factors. It's a hard one to answer. And right? Do you feel, Aurora's question to you is probably one to answer as
Yeah.
well. Any other questions?
Yeah, and people have been urging me to do it online, and I just don't want to.
Yeah, and if that's how you feel,
For anybody else?
ultimately, you probably should not be, you should probably not be doing it virtually and wait until in person. I have about 2 minutes left, or 2 or 3 minutes, in case anybody else has any questions to type in. It might be easier. I don't know if everyone's internet capabilities. So if you have a question, it might be good to type it in versus unmute. And Eric, hopefully you can get the slides to your board. I think that was you that.
Definitely
Oh,
can.
yeah. That's going to be the topic of the next board meeting, is what I learned today.
Yes.
And no one's going to watch a recording. So, don't expect people to do that. I'd say maybe share highlights. All right. I will see you all next Friday.
Wonderful. Good to see everyone. If you do come up with questions, bring them with you next week. All right. Take care.
Thank you.